everybody, I'm Angelina Bennet. I'm a psychologist from the UK. I've been using Type for around 20 years now. And one of my interests is in looking at type development and how we change over time, or if we change over time. And today I'm going to present to you a précis of the presentation I did at APTI conference last year at Salt Lake City, in which I looked at David Bowie and how his personality may have developed and changed over time. So I'm going to assume we all know who David Bowie is at this point. So obviously I'm going to look at David Bowie's Myers-Briggs type, which you should all be familiar with. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with temperament, so I'm going to bring that in. Interaction style is something that the type community has been quite interested in, so that's and that is particularly interesting for him as a performer, so we'll talk about that. And for those of you who are interested in the Enneagram, his Enneagram type really does show a lot in his personality, so interesting to put in there. And then I'm going to talk about type development. There's not time to go through it in depth, but just to give you a taster of those. So you may have guessed from that I'm an INTJ, so multiple models and theories that all link together. It's floating my boat. So why David Bowie? So this was me as a teenager, just the sort of person who'd been looking for someone like David Bowie to come into their life. And as an INTJ, this is how my brain works. I'm either completely uninterested on something or I will become completely obsessed. So I took the obsessed route when it came to David Bowie. So I used to do life-size paintings of album covers. You can see one there. I live in a town called Aylesbury, where David Bowie first premiered his Ziggy Stardust and Hunky Dory. So the town I live in has always had a bit of a love for David Bowie. And just last year, tourist point, we got a statue erected to celebrate that fact. So it's an amazing piece of work that actually looks, interestingly, in connection to what I'm talking about today, it looks at all the different phases and stages he went through in his life. And it plays a song every hour, so it's like a David Bowie cuckoo clock. And this is my most prized possession. It's a towel from David Bowie's Serious Moonlight tour, autographed by him and Mick Jagger. So yes, quite obsessed. So David Bowie obviously is known for being a trendsetter, known for changing his image, his outward image over time, changing his musical styles over time. But in terms of his personality, what I'm hoping to present to you today is the idea that the type doesn't change. It just evolves, develops, integrates, and balances. So there might be some changes going on the inside that are expressed in our behavior, but the type is still the same. So even though someone may become completely different, a different person almost, as they develop and age, their type is actually still there, but it can just look different at different stages of their life. So this is the young David Bowie here with his parents. And you can see here from this school picture, he was always a little bit different, always wanting to stand out a little bit, but in that quiet sort of way. And he's got cool hair there already. So let's look at some of the hypotheses about his type. And I say hypotheses because as far as I know, he never went through any assessment or said this himself, but these are what the experts tend to think. So in Myers-Briggs type, he's thought to be an ISFP, so we'll have a little reminder about what that is. Temperament, obviously the correlation with the SP is the artisan improviser. Interaction style for that type is behind the scenes. And the Enneagram type is thought to be 3 with a 4 wing. So let's have a look at each one of those. So he would lead with introverted feeling as the dominant function. So very, very values driven, really seeking congruence between his inner life and his outer life, who he surrounds himself with, what work he does, having to fit with the values. Often introverted feeling types will have quite humanitarian values as well, so an interest in people, not so much in the actively seeking to go out and help people like extroverted feeling, but having those humanitarian values and wanting to support those. Often introspective, as he was, and often have difficulty expressing themselves outwardly because their sense of identity is so introverted and inner that to actually make themselves feel understood can be quite difficult. This is why many times they do turn to art and creativity to do that. Supported by the extroverted sensing, it's living for experience, looking for variety, not so much change, but variety. And we see that coming through in his career. Living in the moment, so not really hanging on to anything too long, being able to discard something in place of whatever's coming up next that's interesting. So a fairly short-term focus. Very observant, and again, this is evident with David Bowie in the fact that he really kept his eye on the current and emerging trends, and he never actually invented anything, and he freely says this, we'll see this later. He was aware of the zeitgeist, as it were, what was happening right now, and he would almost jump on a new trend as soon as it hatched and make it his own. And often skilled at mimicry, and he did used to like doing impressions and funny voices and things like that. That was a skill that he enjoyed in his more humorous side. So there's some evidence there that type seems to suit him. In terms of the temperament, the artisan improviser temperament, obviously freedom is important, that idea of being free. And this became quite difficult as he became more famous. He wanted the fame, as we'll see later, but then when he got it, he found the impact on freedom was really quite disturbing. One thing that's very clear in this temperament is the needing to be impressive, wanting to make an impact. And that's something he always wanted to do and did right through his career until the end. And even sometimes liking to be a bit shocking. He was one of the first people to cross-dress and have album covers of bands because they had pictures of him with frocks on and things like that. Very sensation seeking. He did go through a phase of seeking a bit too much sensation, which was nearly his undoing, but he managed to come through it. But also always looking for new experiences and exciting things. Spontaneous, and also very playful and fun-seeking. If you watch interviews with David Bowie when he's really relaxed, he really enjoys having fun and having jokes with people. Throwing into this the interaction style of behind the scenes, so that this is where it's quite interesting when you look at the interaction style in line with the temperament, because the temperament's all about wanting to be seen and noticed and impressive and make an impact. Yet the behind the scenes means that will be done in a sort of quite a quiet way at times. So behind the scenes people are usually quiet and calm, which he actually was in his own private life. They like to integrate different perspectives, so seeking, much more of a listener and an observer, seeing what's going on, what other people think, and then bringing that together to make something. And that was very evident in the way he worked. And consulting with others, he really enjoyed collaborating with other artists and other people. And some of those collaborations were long-term. And in some documentaries I've seen that people could say, during the collaboration, you're really close and it's all really intense, and then when it's done, you're sort of out of the picture. So again, that short-term approach and looking for the best possible outcome. So that's evident in the fact that he wasn't what I would call a perfectionist, but he really wanted, if he was going to do something, he wanted to do it well and be the best at it. And then the Enneagram, this is another interesting one because it throws up these tensions. So we've seen there's a bit of a tension between being introverted, being behind the scenes, but having an artisan improviser temperament. But the Enneagram type as well is quite interesting because the type 3s are very success orientated. They want to visibly, outwardly show that they've become successful. They're very adaptable to any situation. And the trick here is to be authentically adaptable rather than chameleon-like. So Bowie could adapt his image and his persona to whatever needed to be there at the time. Madonna is a similar type on this, and you can see how she's changed over time as well and adapts. Very image conscious and wanting to stand out from others. So again, you've got that wanting to stand out, but wanting to be behind the scenes. And with the forewing, it creates an inner tension of, I want to be seen, but I don't want to be seen. I want to be known, but I also want to be mysterious. So the whole identity thing becomes quite a tension point. And I think this also can be seen in how his personality evolved in his work. Okay, one more last model. This is the ego development idea, and there's no time to go into it in huge detail, but it's the idea that we develop in a sequential fashion through these different levels of personal ego development. So these are the names of them here. I'll refer back to them as we go through and say a little bit about each one. But generally what happens is people are less defensive, they get broader perspective, they've got better self-awareness, awareness of others, etc. That's how the development tends to go. So let's look at some evidence through some early quotes. So from 1973, being interviewed, I love humanity, I adore it, it's sensational, sensuous, exciting. So I think that's got the introverted feeling in there and the extroverted sensing to be seen. And also, people are much more important to me than ideas, from a reputable publication called Jackie, every teenage girl's favourite magazine in the 70s. So that idea that the emphasis, the main driver, has always been some sort of people focus, which would support the introverted feeling. Now, this is an interesting one. This seems to support the temperament aspect. But in a, that slightly immature way that somebody might be when they're young, the idea of being bored easily. So I definitely like being a star. It's the only thing I can do that doesn't bore me. So it's a bit of a brash statement, but you can see the artisan temperament coming through. And then another quote from Playboy, another reputable magazine from the 70s. I've always thought the only thing to do was try to go through life as Superman, right from the word go. I felt far too insignificant as just another person. So you can see there, you can see the temperament, you can see the Enneagram style of wanting to be seen, wanting to be something special, wanting to be something different and unique. They're quite unusual, really, for how we might often think of ISFPs. This is what's going on inside. And this quote, I don't know where this came from. I saw it on a TV program in an interview, but he said, "My main driver was I always wanted to be well known." Which is a more polite and gentlemanly way of saying, you know, I want to be famous, and probably has a bit more of that behind the scenes energy to it. I wanted to be well known. So I think there's some clear evidence there that those types we're hypothesizing are probably correct. So, as we said at the beginning, Bowie went through many changes as he went through his career, lots of different images, lots of different phases. But what I want to try and suggest is that there was a bit of authenticity running through this, and at the periods that were a bit difficult for his life, that's maybe where those tensions came through, the identity tensions between what he was becoming and was that congruent with his introverted feeling. And his need for behind the scenes, but this tension for wanting to be well known and famous. So another quote from Playboy, being famous helps put off the problems of discovering myself. So this was in 1976 when he was going through a bit of a phase, quite self-destructive, really trying to shake off some of the personas that he'd worked through, like the Ziggy Stardust and all these costume personas he'd put on. He was trying to be a bit more himself, but was having trouble finding that self. So I think this quote here does indicate there was some hiding or distraction. And And then here, I had to resign myself many years ago that I'm not too articulate when it comes to explaining how I feel about things. My music does it for me. There in the chords and melodies is everything I want to say. So again, being able to not express yourself directly, but through some sort of artistic form. And, you know, sometimes people see him as the innovator. I mentioned this earlier, but he himself would say, I'm a thief. The only art I'll ever study is the stuff that I can steal from. And as Picasso said, it's not what you steal, it's how you use it. So he freely admitted that, and I think this comes into the extroverted sensing of being able to see something in the immediate and adapt it for whatever purpose, you know, that improviser style. So looking at the development, one of the early stages on the development model is a social identification. And this is where you're sort of trying to look for who are you? What group do you fit with? And this seemed to be evident in the way that Bowie tried lots of different things. It's quite interesting thinking of it as the introverted feeling type and the authenticity, because it looked like in his early career, the authenticity part wasn't there. The drive to find something that would work and make him popular was. So he went through all these different incarnations, different bands. He was folky, he was a mime artist, he was a saxophone player, all sorts of different things to try and find what would actually work. And in the end, he settled on the Ziggy Stardust. When he came into the Ziggy Stardust, I think he found his own there and had the support of his wife at the time with her fashion design. So really started to find a niche, but very much hidden behind a persona. And again, it was a bit of a troubling time where he started to lose his identity as himself with the Ziggy Stardust. So again, that conflict between wanting to be behind the scenes, wanting to be seen, wanting to be identifiable, but also wanting to be hidden. So creating these characters served that need, but possibly not in the most authentic way. Very good way for music, though. I would highly recommend you all hear that album. So in identity becoming really important, but hiding behind these different personas. The next stage is called personal identity, and this is where you start to find almost like a bit of like, who are you? And sometimes it can be, I don't care what group I'm in, I don't care if I fit in anymore, I know who I am now. And I think this phase was quite evident when he was in, when he finished the Ziggy Stardust stuff and dropped the personas and went to do the work in Berlin, because he made some albums that he thought might actually be unpopular, but he wanted to make them anyway because he felt that they were more expressive of himself. So he made the albums with Brian Eno that actually everybody loved them, but they were very different to what he'd done before, and he did them for himself. So and when I'm going through these phases, I'm not saying this is absolutely where he was, I'm just saying this is some illustration of how his type became expressed through that. So you can see here the idea of the who am I, introverted feeling, and really sticking to that strongly, wanting to be congruent with yourself, really started to come through here. The next phase is determined action, and this is where people look to achieve certain goals, work with others, and almost like have a direction for their life. Sometimes it can be a bit too planned, but here Bowie he reinvented himself as a pop star. He went with what would sell, what was going to be good. He started creating these collaborations with people who could really help him get ahead, and I think that was the peak of his sort of popular fame, was in this phase. But how it looked in terms of introverted feeling, he was able to use that position of really wanting to be goal focused and get things done, and having that personal presence to do some humanitarian stuff. So if any of you remember the Live Aid concert, Bowie actually worked literally behind the scenes quite a lot on the hunger videos that they showed, the things that they were trying to raise people's awareness of. He had a lot of driving force behind that, but didn't really shout about it. And during the actual performance, even though he, in my opinion, was the best thing on it, he gave up 5 minutes of his own performance time to re-show the campaign video to try and get people to support the cause. So really putting his humanitarian values before his need to be the star of the show. So quite different from how he might have been earlier in his career. And then considerate individualism. This is where people really do start to reintegrate the other parts of their personality. So much more leveling out, what Jung would call starting individuation, I guess. So he became much more family oriented. So that was his early family, but then he reconnected with his son and built a really good relationship and had the new family with Iman. And at this time, he actually did completely back away from the public eye. He did some albums in secret and things, but didn't really want the public attention anymore and was struggling with the fame aspect, but just wanted to focus on being himself, being with his family, being a father. So really finding himself without the need for that external fame and ego boosting gratification. So ego starting to really drop. And then later on, just a few years ago, it seems, coming out with some new surprise albums. And you can see here that he's mimicked an old album cover. So it suggests the idea of looking back over one's life, which again is another sign of development when you can look back. And the stage of integration and authenticity, as I call it, is where you really are integrating the different aspects of yourself. Now, Bowie apparently was very into Jung, and one of the images he used in a later video was this image here of a two-headed being with a female and a male part, so anima, animus, and really reviewing in the background. It was a review of his life, so really it was quite a good indication of where he was in his life at that moment, thinking about who he was, how he was changing, but also retrospectively what had got him to that point. So that's a very interesting video. Where are we now, if you're interested? And the final stage is called the magician. They're just very I think it just sums up Bowie in his later years, the word magician. Just being able to address really difficult situations in an accepting way, you know, really having dropped the ego. And he probably gave himself the most creative death that anybody's ever had. He knew it was coming, and he used his creativity to work through it for himself, to express it to other people, to really face up to what was about to happen. So the Black Star album, if any of you haven't heard it, I highly recommend it, is actually his parting message to everybody. And he was very, very ill when he recorded it, but he still was determined to do it. And this picture was taken actually 2 days before he died, and he's still looking pretty good and cool. It was his birthday. So I just think he's a really lovely illustration of how somebody has really illustrated their type, but the different balances, the different incarnations of it throughout their life. There's always been that shred of authenticity, but even within that authenticity, there's been these tensions where when the authenticity fades, how do you react? And they were the more troubled points of his life. So still an ISFP, but an ISFP who maybe wasn't getting their needs met. And I just wanted to finish on this really nice quote that he said, "Aging is an extraordinary process where you become the person you should always have been." So it's a bit like the Wizard of Oz thing. It was always there to begin with. You just lose it for a while and then you have to re-find it. So yeah, I hope that was interesting, and I hope my fanaticism didn't come through too strongly. Yeah, that's all I have to say on it, and I'm happy for anyone to contact me if they want to discuss it or talk about it or have any questions.